I am in North Berkeley with Bruce Loeb, who's a pianist, a piano teacher, and also, uniquely, a silent film accompanist. And he's going to talk a little bit about this particular area of endeavor. But before I ask him some questions about that, Bruce, tell me a little about your musical background.
Well, I started piano as a kid. When I got to college, I decided no one could stop me from doing music, and I was really intrigued with Baroque music. I studied harpsichord. And at a certain point, I think something about this interest of time and where music comes from sort of coincided with this interest of media and where does the world of media come from. So this watershed of silent movies where you have both live and mechanical performance together. And now we live in a time when people are just completely comfortable with recorded entertainment.
It's very interesting because the live component, the fact that you sit down at the piano at the Niles Museum.
Yeah, that's where I play regularly. In
Fremont, California. You sit down, you have the movie frames running, and you've prepared yourself, however, in some sense, for the score that you have composed. Is that true?
Well, I always study the film that I'm going to play for, and oftentimes you can find films these days on the internet. Sometimes it's not available, and there's also materials that you can find that are written. And sometimes I have very, very little information, and sometimes that works out really well as improvising for a film. Every film is a different event, and it's not only the film, but the particular time and audience that brings out a performance.
That's interesting. Your interaction with the audience, how exactly does that work? Because when you're a performer doing a solo performance, that dimension of the communication between the audience and the performer is very pivotal. Can you tell me how your interaction with the film and the audience coexists?
Well, you're accompanying a silent film, you're really functional music. You're trying to make the film work for an audience. And the audience, I can feel their absorption in the film. And also that people really are wanting, they go to a movie in order to be able to feel that they can be together with other people and also be in a dreamy state. So there's this palpable feeling of allowing people to have that. And it's very, I always say it's not rocket science, but there's a way of doing it better or doing it worse. And I think there's something about getting people off to a good start which allows it to happen.
And when I saw Safety Last, there was already a score recorded and imposed upon the cinema. That must have come later.
Yes.
Because in those days, you actually would have a musician,
well,
an organist.
They really didn't have the technology to have recorded sound. So it really, oftentimes the only existing material you have is something without any soundtrack at all.
Was the organ more prevalent in those days in terms
So
of...
the history of silent films, it really gets going as an industry around 1908, 1909. And this is the era of Biograph and Nickelodeon cinema. And all of a sudden people started to realize it was a real ongoing entertainment, and small Nickelodeon era theaters opened up across the country. And more typically then they would use a piano. It was easier, simpler. In the 20s, the heyday of silent film, you'd have like premiere movie palaces where the theater organ becomes the instrument of a real top-flight entertainment.
And the organist, was he up high, or where was he seated?
No, he'd be underneath the screen typically.
Was it an electronic organ?
Well, pneumatic or, Wurlitzer.
I see. Have you tried the organ at times?
Yeah, no, I played at the Castro. I've been playing at the Castro a couple of times just recently.
So,
and once on the Wurlitzer, which they just had to, it was too old, they weren't able to keep it. So they're in the process of replacing their organ with a more modern instrument. It's sort of a shame because the Wurlitzer was so historic.
now tell me about the schema. You use the word schema instead of saying score. You talk about you're creating a schema for the
Well, I think that's the thing, because it's not a freestanding artwork, like a thorough composed piece. In my case, I'm really responding to the needs of the audience. At the same time, it's like I'm making a roadmap of how to bring out the structure of the movie and how to keep the music interesting and alive. So I combine using some written pieces of music with improvisation, and they give a different texture.
Give me an example of some of the music that you've borrowed and interspersed with your own improvisatory
Incredibly
effusions.
wide variety. Like at times I played for art films that were set in the Renaissance, and I used like music that I know from Baroque period, William Byrd, that would be, you know, like an extreme. Oftentimes music of the 20s, I'm using popular tunes from the 20s. And a lot of films in the 20s, they're really informed by 19th century music, so there's all sorts of opportunity to use that as well.
So you're not really drawing on anything other than the era, what it produced. It's the style of the times. I mean, in terms of borrowing styles of music, the music that was playing in the 20s.
Well, I think it wasn't so standardized. I mean, we live in a much more standardized world, that you would have different, it was very creative and a big part of silent movies, that different musicians used different resources, had different capacities.
Was there any famous people who made their names as accompanists to silent movies?
There were definitely, I don't have it at the tip of my tongue, but there were definitely people who were well regarded and had successful careers. It was a huge industry. There were like, I don't know, I think 30, 40,000 people at the end of the silent era who were employed as working musicians in the silent cinema.
Can you give us an example of at the piano of how you would, some of the schemas you would have produced? I'm going to bring this closer.
This is something that somehow I associate with Buster Keaton.
That's interesting. That's Schubert's
Schubert set of variations.
set of variations. Very
So
interesting.
like also music can be topical. It was like I had a show right after all this horrible events in Paris, and I decided to include in my somewhat French themed show a traditional Parisian song. Series.
And that was the particular film called?
Oh gosh, I don't even know. It was just like a French program, but it's just like to add something topical. That, and last night I was playing for comedy shorts and using a little bit of Ernest Nazareth, who was also a player for the silent cinema in Brazil.
It's amazing, all the variety of emotions that you have there. And you make those decisions after you've actually viewed the film, right? It doesn't happen just impromptu, does it?
Depends on the situation. Some films get more time and more attention and chance to be working out, and sometimes it's very, work a day trying to work at... And so in this comedy last night, I was working with a lot of improvisation, and I'm good at that.
Wow.
But after a while it gets tiring, so and this is a comedy which doesn't need very close playing. It's like people need relief from following the film too much, and I was looking at this wonderful old song from the 20s.
Now, what is the name of the comedy in which you played those particular
Oh
extracts?
gosh, these are really rare. This was a film called All Wet from 1924 with Charlie Chase.
Charlie Chase.
It's a whole world of...
I noticed you showed me a DVD where they give credit to you, of course, in the back for being the silent film accompanist. It was Her Night of Romance. Tell me a little bit about Her Night of Romance.
Her Night of Romance is one of these popular romantic comedies. It's a beautifully made film. An English lord and an American heiress and all the complications of getting together the poor English lord and the wealthy socialite American heiress. So it's one of those films which was very popular at the time, and you have a chance to bring it back for a modern audience with Ronald Colman and Constance Talmadge. So if you know silent films, so people know Ronald Colman. Constance Talmadge was wonderful.
What year was that?
1924.
I see. So that's really fascinating, your whole process of how you do. You must get great fulfillment, derive fulfillment. Tell me the types of fulfillment you have in this particular venue.
Actually, in some ways, one of the biggest fulfillments is it gets me to look at different types of music than I would otherwise. And there's something about this sense of understanding the period of time, understanding this time of people. It's like I go to the movies, and oftentimes when you go to old movies, you can see people you might have remembered from your childhood. You can see some of the same attitudes and characters. And if I play for silent films, I think like, oh, my father might have seen something of this when he was very young, or my grandparents, really, this was their world. So it's that sort of richness to it. And then if you love cinema, there's something about the silent cinema has particular qualities. It's more dreamy. If you go to any picture and you find that people are really absorbed, you'll notice that more often than not, it's those spots in the film where there's less talking, where people are just in the image.
You know, Safety Last, it required very little, written, what is it called, those little...
Intertitles.
Yeah, intertitles, because it was so action-packed, but the music played a greater role for that reason. I noticed that the music tweaked in different, had trills, it reflected the drama and various humorous points with the player, or in this case it was a jazz combo actually, doing instrumental almost ornaments that coincided with the behaviors or the action. It was amazingly harmonious with the events of the film.
Yeah.
It didn't need the word. They didn't need those. What do they call them? Subtitles. Intertitles. Didn't need it at all. Well, tell us finally about what's coming up at the Niles Museum, which is where you
go. I'm doing Son of the Sheikh for their Valentine's Day performance at Rudolph Valentino in February, and next month I'll be playing for their comedy shorts night. Every month they have a program which selects really the best silent shorts of Buster Keaton, Charlie Chaplin, Harold Lloyd, and Laurel and Hardy. That's a really popular program.
And have you already mapped out what you're going to do, or are you going to rely more on inspiration?
Well, no, I haven't. I mean, so the comedy shorts is a little bit different. I mean, I'm just recovering from performing last night, so I haven't really looked at it yet, but...
Just give us a date for that in case people in the Bay here want to go.
I think February 23rd, Saturday night, and
7:30
at 7:30 in Niles
Fremont.
District of Fremont, and February 13th. It's also a Saturday night in Niles at 7:30.
Well, thank you very much, Bruce, for this very enlightening interview and very unique. Many people don't know much about silent film accompanying schemas, so we really appreciate you giving us this time today. Thank you.